This seminar, I'm going to take the opportunity to discuss the broad issue of our phosphorus recommendations. And there are a lot of people who've been involved over the years. I'm sure that my list here is probably too short, and I'm missing a number of people. But when I started back in 1984, people like Don Sander, Gary Peterson were really people who worked a lot on phosphorus. In the intervening years, I've had a lot of conversations, and I'm going to go through some of the research and effort that some of these people have done, as well as what I've done, because as you will see as I go through this, that I have kind of an interest in updating our phosphorus recommendations. And I do want to recognize the fact that there are people from industry like Tim Mundorf from Midwest, Mark Pavlik, who's a consultant, who's also spent a lot of time thinking about these issues and helped inform me of some of the view from the other side of the industry. But I'll take responsibility for what I say. This is really my opinion, my interpretation of some of the results that I'm going to share. But just a brief background of the Haskell Ag Lab. What you see here is aerial photograph of our 320 acres, and it's really jam-packed. You can see there's plots all over the place. It was 320 acres when I got there in '84. It's 320 acres now. We just have about 80 acres of irrigation under the, let's see, where is my little arrow? I don't have an arrow. I need an arrow to work. All right. All right, thanks. I know the people who are out there in computer land can't see unless I have this arrow. And since I spent a lot of time out there watching seminars from this room, I know exactly what it's like not to be able to see where people are pointing. Little dig there. So anyway, I have a long-term study up here, and we have a study here, and then there's one down here, which I'm going to talk about later. But that's what the Haskell Ag Lab is. It's mostly rain-fed. So today I'm going to focus on phosphorus. I'm going to give a little bit of background on some of the science that we use as soil scientists. I figured that a lot of the people who might come to this weren't soil scientists, so those are my colleagues in soils. It'll be a little bit of repeat. I'm going to talk about the UNL recommendations, something about the general soil phosphorus levels in the state, and then give a short lit review of research in Nebraska over the last 30 years or so that are focused on the issue. My concerns are, the question I have is whether with the current high yields, which are about twice what they were when I started, whether our recommendations are still valid. And I'm going to end up, I don't think I'm going to answer the question, are we going to change? But I think I'm going to come down on the side that we need to really think about it a lot. So just to get us oriented in some of the background in soils, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on soil chemistry, but some of the recent thinking about what's happening in the soils. You can think of soil phosphorus in 4 pools, and there's a range of availability. The point I want to make here is that what's in the yellow is what we see when we take a soil test. We're taking some of the P from the soil solution, which is at fairly low concentration, and some P from the absorbed surfaces. We are not really getting any handle on the P here that's strongly bonded or in our mineralogy or something like that. So part of the issue that we're going to see as we go through this is we're measuring only part of the pool, and as we remove P from this yellow pool, we are getting some movement from this other side, and so we can't do a complete mass balance of P issues because we don't know how fast and how much is coming across there. My interest is in the recommendations that we give our farmers, and we have a number of publications that do that. I would like to say that the suggestions, that our recommendations are suggestions here. They're not the law, they're not the rule. But sometimes once the university puts something in print, people pick it up as the word. And so we want to be careful about what we put in there, and we want it to be as accurate as possible. So that's what motivates me to do this thinking. Now, when we do a soil fertility recommendation, we base it on soil tests, but not all agronomists look at soil tests the same way. There are a number of different strategies that people can use. And the one that we use in Nebraska is called the deficiency correction strategy. And it sort of comes from the medical model. You know, if you need an antibiotic, they give you an antibiotic. If you don't need it, you know, it's not going to do you any good. So with this strategy, we feel that if we're recommending phosphorus, there needs to be a yield response to pay for that phosphorus. If there's not going to be a yield response, then why are you doing it? And this is really the traditional Nebraska model. I mean, those guys that I put up there earlier, you know, I had them for classes when I was a grad student, and this was the gospel. Those of you who are my age or older will recognize that. And they're very adamant about that, and it's really not a bad strategy, but it's not the only strategy. One of the other strategies is to maintain and build to a level where you never get down to where you might need the phosphorus. The problem with the deficiency correction idea is that you might lose yield. And so the question that's going to be behind a lot of what I'm saying today is, why should we have a fertilizer recommendation that means that people might be losing yield before we apply new material? And then the third strategy that is in common parlance is just crop removal. Put on what you remove. That has a lot of appeal. It's very simple. It talks to the question of sustainability. You're not going to deplete it. But we have a lot of soils that have a lot of P, and there's no benefit to putting P on soils that are very high testing. So there are two other concepts that we need to understand before we talk about the actual soil tests and their interpretation. One is we have to have an extractant or a chemical test that we feel confident mirrors what is coming out of the soil. And then we have to calibrate that to be able to say how much fertilizer or nutrients we need to add. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the correlation or whether our chemistry is correct. There are people who are coming up with some newer tests, but I'm going to spend all my time really on the calibration part, how we come up with how much fertilizer to recommend. So this would play out. If you had a very low testing soil, we'd recommend more fertilizer to get response. You probably understand that and have seen many recommendations. For the deficiency correction philosophy or strategy to work, we need to understand there's a concept called critical level. And for corn, we use 15, and essentially that's the magic point where if your soil is less, there's a significant probability that you're going to get a yield response by adding phosphorus. And you know, different crops may have different critical levels. So the question, one of the questions that we will want to look at is whether our critical levels in Nebraska are still valid. This table that you're looking at now was in the NEB guide when I was hired. It was in the NEB guide when I started as a master's student. It was probably in the NEB guide when I started my undergraduate work. I don't know exactly when it was put together. Probably everybody who was involved is dead, but I don't know. The one thing to note, I'm only going to worry about broadcast and not placement, too many issues. We did make a change in about 6 or 7 years ago where we added these formulas that you can see at the bottom of the page. And essentially from our extension circular, we put in a continuous function. This 25 minus the Bray level times 4 is our standard recommendation now for corn. We did find, and I'll show the data later, that we did have a little different response whether we're following soybeans or corn, so we have 2 different lines. But this critical level of 15 that I talked about, this equation gives exactly the same phosphorus recommendation at those points where we changed as the old table. So when it's 15, we have a 40. The only difference is we say you can put a little bit of P if you're in the 15 to 25 range. So that was kind of a long introduction to the problem that I want to address. If we use corn, we talk about corn grain removal. Now, I think in terms of farmer math, and I use English units, and I know should use metric, but I don't think that way. So I apologize, I guess. If I really was sorry, I would have changed it to metric, but I'm not that sorry. So those of you who are not familiar with the English system, I'll just say that P2O5 is what farmers think of, and it's 2.3 times elemental P. So these numbers are all in this phosphate number. It's pretty hard to change this, so we just have to go with the flow. But when I started 30 years ago, 125 bushel dryland yield wasn't too bad, and that comes out to about 44 pounds of removal, which if you look at our recommendation, remember at 14 parts per million, we were recommending 40 pounds of P2O5. So even though Prof. Olson wouldn't say we're doing crop removal, at that level, at the critical level, we were putting on removal. That's my opinion. But now we have 250 bushel yield goal. That's not surprising. I have farmers who would be disappointed sometimes with 250. So we have 88 pounds of removal. And we did change our recommendation, so we give a little bit of P, but we don't give a lot of P in this 25 to 15. So we can argue about how long it's going to take to draw down the soil, but if we remove 88 pounds a year, no matter what soil, at some point we're going to reach 15, and when we reach 15, we're only going to put on 40, and we'll never get ahead of the game. We'll always be in a permanent negative. That's the problem right there that caused me to think about this. And we never looked at yield goal as part of the phosphorus recommendation. We've always looked nitrogen as part. We use a yield goal. With P, we haven't. So I'm making the assumption that yields are going to be limited if we keep going with what's in our extension material if we don't change. Now, that's the bad news. The good news is a lot of people don't even know what we recommend and don't follow it. So it may not be that bad. But I would like, for us to be a little bit mirroring reality. If we look around the states near us in the region, and we look at soil tests that are higher than the deficiency. So we don't use Optimum in Nebraska, but some states code it at Optimum. We might code it at high. But if we look around, some of them use a crop removal recommendation. Arkansas doesn't do anything. Iowa has a straight number. There's various things, but some use crop removal, some don't. Nebraska, we really don't, except for that little bit that I told you about. So there's states out there with different policies, different philosophies. Scott Morrell talked last week from IPNI, and they've put together some data over time, different states, what their critical level is. Remember, that's at what level we think that you need to apply phosphorus if it's lower than that level. And if you look at the surrounding states, Nebraska has the lowest critical level. And many people have criticized us for our low critical level. So that may be an issue. I don't think that's a big issue, but just so you can see what other people are saying and doing. They've also put together some data about what the median soil test level is. Nebraska in 2010 was 18. Remember, our critical level is 15. So we're actually 3 parts per million higher. Our neighbors with a higher critical level have a lower soil test level. So the good news is maybe they're even listening less closely in South Dakota and Kansas than in Nebraska. But they vary, and what's important also is how this changes over time. And they haven't done the 215 study yet, but Nebraska has lost 4 parts per million in that 2005 to 2010 period. Other states have also lost average values. So this probably not a problem now when the median is 18, but if we lose 4 every 5 years without a change, we are going to get to a place where we are going to have deficiencies. I think this is cumulative sampling. They had thousands of samples. They have a booklet that goes into the methodology. So it could be, I don't know, 100,000. They go to the different labs. What? Yeah. So, I mean, there are various things. You could kind of say that the data, there are probably data points that are not really valid, but for every high one, there might be a low one. So, and if they do the same methodology over time, maybe it tells you something, maybe not. Another way to look at it is, and I don't know the methodology here, but they did some kind of database calculation on nutrient balance, so how much corn is produced and how much pea is bought and all that kind of thing. And they did come up with the idea that in Nebraska, we are under-fertilizing about 10 pounds per acre per year, which is what is accounting for our drop in the median P levels. So from our point of view, in extension, the question has always been, lost my friend again, here we go. The question has always been, if you build your soil past that 15, are you going to get more yield? And that's what troubled Prof. Olson and those guys, is they really had no data that building the soil was going to increase yields. That's why they were so adamant about the deficiency correction idea. And that's why we've used it for so long, is that we really have very little data that will support building it. The only thing we can think about now is whether that high yields is driving the system a little differently. So we have some specific questions that I'm thinking about. Should we increase our critical level? Should we add a build component? So in other words, if we change from 15 to 25, should our application recommendations put enough phosphorus, more than what the crop needs, so that we can get to 25? That's what the traditional build has been. And then removal would be, when we're over our critical level, should we put some fraction or all of what's being removed so we aren't depleting our soil? We have to think a little bit about how people take their soil samples. Back when these recommendations were made, there wasn't precision ag, there wasn't grid sampling, and most of the sampling was in 20 to 40 acres if they were following directions. Sometimes it was 120 acres in one sample. And when you take a sample in 120 acres, you're gonna hit 40 and you're gonna hit 10, and you might average 15. And so there's a lot of situations where you can imagine that the soil test level came back at 15, they put on phosphorus, and the total yield for that field was increased, because where they had the 10s, they increased the yield, even though where there was 35, they didn't do any good. But as we move to 2 acre grids or less, we can find where that low P is and just remediate that particular one. So those things we need to take into account. And then the sustainability factor is those big pools that are not available. At some point, we're going to deplete them. We can not put out P and pull from them for a long time, but at some point, they're going to go to a very low release level, because there's only a finite amount of P there. This is not something you can grow like a legume and produce N. So I'm going to go through some studies now that have been conducted in the past and are concurrent. This is the granddaddy of them all. This is the gold standard, the University of Nebraska soil test comparison. Some of you, Max remembers that, I'm sure. Prof. Olson, Ken Frank, these guys They were adamant that a lot of soil testing labs were over-recommending fertilizer, and they essentially compared the recommendations from different labs to the university recommendation. And this was very well received, and a lot of states had copycat research, and pretty much everybody found about the same thing. I came in at the end of this study and looked at the data, and it's probably one of the cleanest data sets I've ever worked with in terms of no outliers. It was clear as day what the answers were. And there were two answers. If you did the maintenance and build, you spent more money, and you got the same yield. And you can go down whether it's irrigated or whether it was dry land like a Concord, but that was the same conclusion. Very strong. Maintenance and build was expensive. Now, this was more than phosphorus. There was potassium and micronutrients, which increased the cost. So this was not designed to really compare the philosophies, but it could be interpreted that way. So back in the 70s and 80s, nothing wrong with our critical level or our deficiency correction. At about the same time, the same people, George Ream, Prof. Olson, Frank Anderson from out west, were funded by TVA, and they had a study of phosphorus, and they looked at 6-year phases where they would put P out, same amount of total P in 6 years, but it would be every year, every other year, every third year, every 6 years. And they wanted to look at yields and change in soil levels and things like that. And Dennis and I, we were in on the end of that study, putting it together. If we look at the soil tests over time, between 73 and 80 would be 83 here. Irrigated maize was out at Meade, and the non-irrigated was up at the Haskell Ag Lab. And this is in metric units, so this would be kilograms of P per hectare, applied every year. And first thing you can see is if you put a lot of P on, you increase the soil test. And if you don't put any P on, you do decrease the soil test, but you're not drawing it down as quickly as you're increasing it here. And that's because the residuals, the part of the soil P that we can't test is coming into solution. At least that's my interpretation. If you look at the yields, this is for the Meade site. A little bit of yield increase, but it was maximized out at about 22. And that's probably, again, a little bit around the removal rate. At Concord, we were lower yielding because it was irrigated, not irrigated. We got a few bushels as well. But there's no real evidence here that building the soil to high levels is going to increase our yields more than if we just supply what is needed. Which moves us closer to now. Charlie Wortman and others who, we're getting into current history here. But Dr. Wortman had a study on corn and sorghum. I'm only going to just mention briefly the corn study. We looked at different methods of starter application. The objective was not to validate our critical level or anything like that. But what we found was that we only got significant yield increases from the starter when we were on irrigated soils that were less than 15 part per million. On dry land, there were some increases, very small, and where we had higher soil test levels, we didn't get much of a response. All this is, I'm driving home the point that I have no evidence that our critical level is wrong. Even kind of more recently, when Akeem Doberman was here, we had, and Dave Tarkelson, we had the Nebraska Soil Fertility Project, which was funded by the state, actually pesticide fund. We had 3 years, 12 sites where we tested the university N and P recommendations as well as sulfur. And Charlie Wortman put this slide together. I'm not exactly sure for what reason, but I stole it from him from another talk because it kind of illustrates the question. The question is, if we build high soil P levels, will we increase our yield? And the slide here is not to show that we will decrease yields, but we don't have any evidence that just building our sites to higher P levels, and here you got 50, remember our critical level is down here, that we're going to up the overall productivity. There are reasons that we have high soil P levels. If you have unproductive fields, but you still put phosphorus on, you're going to build up the soil test level. So again, I'm not trying to say that high P produces lower yields, but we don't have evidence that we should be building up our soils to high levels. If we look at the actual data from our sites, this line is the critical level. We have 5 significant sites where putting 41 pounds of P2O5 increased yields. 4 of them are below the critical level, and 1 is pretty darn close. We had some yield increases at these higher levels, but we had just as many decreases. So, you know, there's nothing in this data that tells us that our critical level is wrong, at least the way I read that. We can summarize the data in a little table here, and this is the evidence that we use for changing our soil test recommendations based on the previous crop. Where we had those sites following soybeans, we got significant yield increases, but only when the soil test level was under 10. With corn, we broke it out here at 20. This actually wasn't a significant increase, but it was 11 bushels. And where we had high soil test levels, there's no evidence that we have really high productivity, and there was no yield increase at all. Again, we have evidence that our critical level in that 15 range probably isn't too bad, and we've already taken into account in our recommendations the following soybeans. So we've used that information. Another ongoing study, or the first ongoing study that I'm going to discuss, is one that Richard Ferguson and Glenn Slater are conducting out at the South Central Ag Lab. And Richard's not here, so he gave me the data, but he won't see exactly how I'm interpreting it. But it's a long-term P study. They started in 2002. So when they started, there's a little variety there in terms of the reps, but it averaged about 10 part per million. So this should be a P-responsive site. There are a number of treatments. It's an N rate by P rate study. They go up to 220 pounds of N. I am going to show you all the data, but focus on where N is not limiting, because I'm not really interested in you know, where N is limiting. But he has a fair amount of data there. If we look at the effect of putting out phosphorus over the change in soil test level, and I just picked out a couple of dates. There's March in 2007, 2009, 2012. After 5 years, there's not much difference between the different N rates in terms of the P buildup. But over time, with the lower yield in the no nitrogen plots, we're building up the P to higher levels. And right now, it looks like the 120, 220 N rates probably yielding about the same, because the soil levels are going up. One thing to note, that if we started out around 10, so where they put 0 P, it's been drawn down a little bit, and to get to the 15 critical level, they would need to have higher than 40 pounds per year. They had 40 and 80, so they don't have one here. The 80 is a little bit too much, and we've built past the critical level. But putting 40 pounds out a year, which is the university recommendation, at 10 part per million, we're still not up to where our critical level is. If we look at the yields for that study, you know, you can see the effect of nitrogen. You need nitrogen to get the best yields. But you know, you would have to, you are getting a little bit more yield up here, but it's really amazing to me at the 0 P levels of those soils, how much yield we're getting, even after, this is 2014, so there's 12 years of cropping on soils that started at 10 part per million, and we're just getting slight yield increases with this high amount of P. So there's no real evidence here that we have to have really high that we're getting tremendous yield increases. That's one of our problems in our P research, is the difference between the 0 and the highest yieldings. Sometimes it's only 10, 15 bushels, which is hard to draw curves. We love to draw regression curves, and if you don't have any change in height, you're not going to get a very good regression curve. So I turned the data around and decided to look not at the P treatment, but what the soil tests were testing in the various plots. And I think 2013 was the last soil test data I have. So this is soil test values down here. The black line is the average of 5 years. And if you look at this curve here, you know, it stops increasing pretty well, pretty close to about 12 or 13. Certainly at 15, you know, you want to call this a little bit higher yield or than this, you can, but to me it's pretty flat up here. Again, not a lot of evidence that increasing our soil test level past 15 is going to actually increase our yields. Am I beating a dead horse here? Okay, so that's my literature review of the review of what's been going on up to the stuff that I'm actually more involved with. And up at the station, I have 3 sites that deal with phosphorus. They're all dry land. The soils up there are, they can be calcareous. This field here is more calcareous. There's terraces. It's sloped. It's pretty poorly productive land. It's dry land. It's not the greatest. And then this site here is actually where the old soil test comparison was run by George Ream, my predecessor. And then because of the results from this study, we started another study that's funded by IPNI. And I'm going to just quickly go through those results. The first study, where we have rates and timing, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on, except to show you again soil test levels and yield. And here is our critical level. Certainly below 15, we're getting some response. If you want to believe that we're getting a little more yield at the higher soil test level, you could draw probably, you know, a linear line here showing slight increases with the 38-21 soil test. The only thing is this is confounded because I have knife treatments, and so these knife treatments are the ones with the higher yield, and because it's knifed in, the P levels are a little bit higher because they're not mixing with the soil as well. So that's a little bit confounded, but there's some evidence there. My main study that I've been working on the last 10 years, which has actually stimulated me for thinking about this, is something that I thought about for a long time before I actually implemented, and that is if we maintain different soil test levels, like 15, 30, 45, will we get better yields? Now, most of the studies are like the one where Richard had, where he puts out rates of P and sees what happens, as compared to creating a field that has these levels in them that are randomized, and the whole point is to see if we're going to get higher productivity. So in this study, I have a couple of checks. I have no fertilizer. I have nitrogen alone without phosphorus. And then I have actual treatments where the goal is to maintain the soil at different soil test levels. And I use a little formula. It's not the university recommendation formula. It's different. If someone wants to see that later, we can talk about it. And then I have a crop removal. Now the whole point, I guess the whole key is that we started the experiment right around the critical level. If you start too high or too low, then you have to, then this may not be as valid. But the idea would be to try to build up low sites or bring the high sites down to the critical level so you can have a valid test. So when I do this as an extension talk, I hand out this little sheet. I give it to farmers or whoever's in the audience. I ask them to quiz themselves, do a mental experiment of what you think the results would be. Again, this is dry land up there at Haskell. It's on north soils, which are not the most productive. So between 2000 and 2011, with no phosphorus at all, we had about 120 bushel yield. So if we don't put any fertilizer on, how much yield loss would we get, assuming you think we'd get loss? And then with the different strategies, how much yield increase? And I fill in the blanks and tell them we got 11 bushels using this 15, and it took 36 pounds per acre. And these are what the soil tests were. Again, you know, if we had more time, I'd let you think longer about it. But this is what we found. I take the 2002 data out of it because thinking that it takes a while for the different P treatments to build up, because if you put on a lot of P, it doesn't, you don't get the result right away in terms of the growing environment. So if we just assume that from 2003 to 2011, that's the treatments are in place, and that may or may not be true. Here's the no fertilizer. What color is that, tan or orange? I don't know, colorblind, but that is the no P treatment. And what is of interest is that the crop removal treatment is a pretty good yielding treatment compared to the 15 and the 30. And we see a trend. Not every year is this significant, but the 45 actually has a little bit more productivity than the 15, which goes counter to everything I've already told you this afternoon. But that's what got me intrigued on this issue. We had a big drought in 2012, and we had a rootworm problem last year, so I've only summarized here to 2011. So if we want to fill out, I'm sure you, now I've given you a little bit of a hint because I showed you the data, but we can fill out the form a little bit. And what's interesting is that the crop removal is a pretty good treatment compared to the 15. It's actually better than the Bray 30, and it only takes about 6 pounds of P per year more. So this goes against, you know, our gospel that crop removal is not the way to go, and we've built the soils up a little bit. And it looks like I'm doing a pretty good job here, right, of my 15, my 30, and the 44. Well, it's taken 11 years to get there. It's not easy to do. This is what it looks like over time. And I was, even though I wasn't a graduate student in 2000, I was really impatient. You know, if you're a grad student, you want to build them up right away because you got to do your research. So I used 20 pounds to build up 1 part per million, and I kind of overshot my 45 by about 90. So it's taken me a while to draw that down to where it actually is 45. So, but maybe we've learned something from that. But anyway, we're about where we want to be now. So with that study in place, we formed a group, Tim Shaver from the West, Charlie Wortman from here. We got a little bit of money from the International Plant Nutrition Institute to expand this to look at the effect of tillage as well as some of these strategies. And I'll just show you a little bit of data from that. Unfortunately, even though we see some trends in increasing yields based on the Bray, here we, instead of 30 and 45, we have 25 and 35 Bray targets. And there and here, the UNL rec is actually using the recommendation procedure. As compared to my Bray 15, I had a whole different strategy for maintaining 15. So this is a real test of whether our recommendation is going to hold up under higher yields. Up here, we have the soil test level. You can see the check has been brought down a bit. Removal here, in this case, is not holding up as well as it did at Concord on our dry land. And the study at Mead is irrigated, so it's a higher yield level. Again, this is not a significant increase, but it's kind of trending that way. We started in 2011, so we're really just getting into the transition. Dr. Wortman said that he found 2 of the reps where this UNL treatment was very low. So this may not be, this may be higher than it looks like, or if, since my thesis is that the university recommendation is going to draw down P, this really fits it very well, because it should be closer to 15. That's what we want it to be. At Howe, you know, we're about the same. Our removal is doing very well. We did have a little bit of significance at 0.1 there. Okay, so I'm going to just summarize. I've gone through a lot of research fairly quickly, but I wanted to build a case for whether we're going to get high yields if we build our soil up, because it's critical. When we rethink our recommendations, if we think the 15 value is wrong, we need to be able to defend it. And the earlier studies, clearly 15 was fine. The clay center that I showed you, I think it probably shows that 15 isn't too bad. There are some trends in the most recent ones where we're getting a little bit more yield for the higher lessons, but they're not really significant consistently. So where does that leave us? Well, I would say that it's not the critical level that's important. There's no real convincing evidence that the 15 is a problem. But I think we have to address the drawdown issue. And so what we need to do is figure out a way to allow soils that are really high, 60, 100, draw down closer to maybe, let's say, 25, and avoid drawing them all the way down to 15 so that we have to build them up. And we might have to have two different recommendations for where we have normal soil sampling or traditional soil sampling versus intensive soil sampling. Where we really know what's out there, I think we can be a little bit more precise on our critical level. But when we just are taking an average of 40, that 15 may not really be right because we don't know the distribution. Okay, so I'm going to end. I've taken about 45 minutes. And Dennis said I only had 40, so I'm pushing the time limit. But I'm going to leave you with not a real recommendation, but the idea that we need to consider some things. So what you have in front of you is a graph that I got the template from Mark, who is a consultant up in the Northeast area. We've worked together on a lot of projects, and he's really interested in this. So he has his own recommendation as a consultant, so he's this brown line. But the blue line here is the university recommendation as it is. And then this is his recommendation. And the yellow is the removal of P at 230 bushels per acre yield expectation. Now we can change that, and I think a new recommendation may want to change that. He played around with some things where he looked at the UNL recommendation plus half of removal. So this line is pretty much parallel to this line. The advantage of this line, and I'm not promoting this particular equation with half removal. I'm just saying we need to consider something like this. From the university point of view, I think we would agree that at some point it's too high and we can stop applying phosphorus. But we don't want to get to the point where we draw down to 5 part per million where we would apply 80, because we're going to get yield losses. It's very hard to get down to 5 part per million. Those experiments I showed you earlier, even with 10 years of no P, they were still testing 7 or 8. So in this particular case, the 80-pound recommendation goes across the removal right at 15, which is our critical level. If we change the yield goal, this is going to move. But something like this is what the soils group is going to have to do. So I'm not going to make a recommendation here for exactly what we should do. My colleagues in the soil extension group and in the resident instruction, if they want to join us, can discuss this further. So with that, I'm going to finish. Any comments, questions? Yeah, Tom.
What's it cost to put 80 pounds per acre on?
I don't know what it is. What is it, about 60? I don't know, 65 cents a pound at P205 now. I haven't checked. Does anyone have more recent? It goes up and down between 50 and 75. I haven't called. Anybody know?
Martha verified you. Martha verified you.
It's about 60 cents right now.
Okay. Yeah.
Charlie, most of your metrics are based on yield. And yet we know that moisture and climate and all these things affect that. Do you have any data with tissue testing and silking or anything like that to confirm what you're finding?
You mean in terms of whether there's deficiency out there? I don't know if Richard has any on his study. On those studies that we do up at Concord, we haven't done any. All we test is P in the grain, so we see what we're removing. And we might make visual comments on early season yellow and green. I mean, chlorophylline some of them, but that's not really a P variable. Yeah, I can.
Grain yield is, let's say, well, most part of grain is starch. How does the concentration of P in the grain changes at different yield levels? Because if, let's say, if there's a dilution kind of effect, then the removal rate at higher yield may not matter that much in terms of
well, we do grain P on these studies, and I use 0.35. Well, first of all, it depends on the year. Some years it's closer to 0.4. On our 0P, the grain P is much lower. It might be closer to 0.3. It might get below 0.3 occasionally, but so I don't know, when I went to school, they might call that luxury consumption. I mean, you can increase your concentration of P in your grain when you have high P in the soil and you put on a lot of P. So your removal is increased on those high P sites. And on the TPA, on that, on this study here, okay, on this study here, we sample every plot, and for the grain removal, we put out on the plot individual P rates based on what's in the soil and what we harvested from that plot. And then it's, these data are averaged over 4 reps, but there's 6 rows by 60 feet. We manage each plot by itself, so we have a pretty good idea of what the amount of P is we put on, and then the removal. And we will increase the P when we increase our P rate. I don't know if that gets to your question.
Yeah, but another related question is, okay, we have this critical level of P in soil, but how about the critical level of P in plant?
So you're asking if it's 250 bushels versus 120?
Many nutrients have the critical level, and then what's the relationship there?
Well, a critical level, if you're taking a plant sample, a leaf sample at 6-leaf stage, they would have a critical level for concentration. I don't know what I would say about the grain level. That's already too late to diagnose a problem. A number of people have taken plant samples at 6-leaf or 9-leaf, and you can increase your P in a small plant with a lot of these treatments. But by the time you get to tasseling or to yield, you're not seeing the same kind of yield response, especially at, like let's say you have 20 or 25 parts per million soil. You can increase early growth, and that's what farmers see. Their starter mechanism might break or something, and they do a strip where they don't have starter, and then they come back 3 weeks later or 4 weeks later, and there's this much height difference and 3 shades of green difference. They go, wow, that starter's being fantastic. But then you come back 6 weeks later and you ask them where it is in the field, and they can't find it unless they put a flag in front of it. So, but obviously there's going to be P. It's hard to see a P response on that picture, aerial picture of that study. What you're seeing is lack of N in those yellow plots. I mean, if you can go and walk, in front of each plot, and if I look at this plot and I look at the leaves touching, and then I look at this plot and they might be this far apart instead of this far apart, you can probably tell which are the lower. You can tell which are different, but you have to be out there and really observing the plant. You're not going to see it from the road very easily.
You didn't touch any on the, when you're putting it on with your planter, whether the rates will make a difference. And then long-term no-till.
Well, the study that Charlie Wartman kind of conducted with sorghum and corn was all starter-based. And we put it in the furrow, we put it 2 by 2, and then we actually dribbled it behind. And so it was all banded. And there was no real difference in method there. But what I showed you, what I told you was just based on the soil test. The one study that I only showed on one graph, we had knife, starter, and broadcast, and I can't get to the ones that are not hidden, are hidden. All right, well, technology is not as good, but on the PowerPoint I did have the data where we are looking at banding in the starter and broadcasting and knifing. Actually, I'm picking up knife. No, we started doing this in 2000. So in 2000, the last few years where I knifed, and I've been knifing for 12 years, I'm beginning to get higher yields and you sort of increase soil P levels. But it's pretty much taken a number of years to build up that P down there at 6 inches. We do have a tillage component to the IP&I, and that's what we added. Charlie and Tim and I, we have a disc and a no-till. And there's no significant interaction, so I just put the average. But, and I think Charlie's was the same way. He may remember better than I. But in 2014, we had at Haskell, we had about a 30 bushel increase by disking compared to no-till. And I think his was less, but about 10 bushels, which I don't remember the exact number. But there was a difference this year. Now, not every year it goes towards the disking, but this year it did. Okay.
With the removal of corn stover for livestock feed and potentially for bioenergy, is this going to have to be addressed?
For phosphorus?
Yeah.
I don't know. I pull out my handy dandy IP&I laminated card and corn silage, so that's not exactly stover. I wonder if they had stover, but corn stover, you want it per ton? They say 5 to 8 pounds per ton. My experience with IP&I numbers are that they're a little bit high. Their grain bushel is 0.38. I use 0.35, so 5.8, maybe it's 5.5. Yeah.
We have 2 chat questions. Okay. The first is, do corn hybrids have different phosphorus requirements than even 10 years ago?
Well, we haven't really tested that. My feeling is that, it's all about the soil and that critical level. I don't think that they've done a lot to change that. I mean, there may be some indirect artifact of having better root structure. They're breeding the corn, they're adding corn rootworm resistance, they're adding better water usage and efficiency, and so there may be some indirect phosphorus thing, but we haven't tested that at all.
The second is a question of density of grid samples and interpolation method for P. There's a parentheses IDW and creating settings, i.e. range, spread nugget.
All right, well, if he's asking what is the best way to do the precision ag mapping, I would say Creed. Creed?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, that's not my area, so if somebody here, yeah, we can have a discussion.
Do we have any interest in band placement for the infrared cropping system?
In what?
Band placement.
Yeah, a band placement. Well, that knifing that I told you about is a band underground.
And how big is that?
That seemed to be okay. It actually was starting to improve yields, maybe 8 to 10 bushels, but it took a number of years of doing that before that actually took place. There's a little bit of trade-off. If you're just in the study that we did, we didn't have a combination. We just had one or the other. And you can make the case, and others have, is that you should probably put a little bit with the plant and then put more in the second location, but I don't have that tested. Yeah.
Charles, is there a commonality across states for soil depth? There's two states.
What is that?
Soil samples.
Yeah, we take, our standard recommendation is 8 inches. And, you know, on our plots, we might take deeper than that to characterize it. In that study, the TVA study, we did samples a lot deeper, but about all you can do is characterize, you know, a site. We're not going to be able to create an experimental site where, you know, one plot has feet all the way down and another not. Actually, when I first started, I think Dan Walters and Don Sander, they came up there with a ditch, and they made a trench about 3 feet deep and put phosphorus in there and then covered it up. But I don't think that ever panned out. I don't understand the data. People have thought about it. If we're cropping, we are going to be removing the peat from the subsoil. And one of the reasons I didn't spend much time on it, but where we're replacing with crop removal, we're actually increasing our soil test level. And my reason for that is we're putting all the new peat on the surface, but we're mining peat from below that. And we don't really have, we don't have the technology to replace that. I mean, maybe you could have a reverse growing root that dies or something, but I mean, it'd be maybe tillage radish, right? And then have it spray peat on the leaves and then our plant diggers will have to create that. Yeah.
Charlie, do you have any comments about the people who do strip tilling and dual placement of nitrogen and phosphorus?
Great question. I would like to see some data from doing that. You know, when I started in the mid-'80s, Don Sander was doing some dual placement, and theoretically, you're supposed to get a little better uptake. I never, my research showed that that really increased yield. But you know, when you're in a 2 and 3 year research cycle, it may be better. It may be something that you have to do for 10 years. But I don't really have an answer to that. I know the exact